Hi there, it's Toby Jones and welcome back to the channel. Today's video will discuss why you should always give albums a second chance. And this is something that is very much off the cuff for me to do. It's something that I've thought about just this evening. So there's no script as such. There's a couple of notes that I've made, but sure enough, we are laden with props everywhere as you would expect. But today's video is inspired by something that happened on the weekend. And it made me think, this has happened quite a lot. And actually pushed me to make this video with several examples of why you should give albums a second chance. So it is inspired by this album here, Thin Lizzy's Bad Reputation. Now, Thin Lizzy is probably my favourite group of all time, if not one of the favourites at least. And I was researching actually at the weekend. I call it researching, playing music. I don't really think playing music is classed as researching, but there you go. I was researching for a series that I'm looking at doing on the channel, and this isn't really a spoiler because other people have done it before. I've picked out 5 or 6 of my favourite bands, performers, and looked at where they have a great run of albums. So, in a run of albums where all the albums are really good. And I thought Thin Lizzy would be an excellent place to start because that route from the Fighting album in 1975 to Black Rose in 1979 is a really excellent run. But I'd always had the impression that this album, Bad Reputation, which is the 4th of 5, or the 5th of 6th, well, 4th of 6th if you include the Live and Dangerous live album in the middle. I always had the impression from listening to those albums that Bad Reputation was by far the weakest. Now, because I was researching for making that video, which will hopefully be coming in a couple of weeks' time, and probably now I've said that, will never be released. But I was listening to this album just as research for that to say if really things were as bad as I thought. And bad probably isn't the word to use at all, because this, I thought, was a pretty solid, decent album, looking at the tracks on it. And this isn't such a Thin Lizzy video, so we're not going to go into this in much detail. There's probably maybe 1, 2, 3 really excellent tracks, and the rest of it I thought, it's okay. But listening to this Saturday evening, I thought, I've got to admit I was wrong here, because pretty much every track, maybe bar 2, were excellent. And maybe that makes a point for the album format as a whole, the CD, the vinyl, whatever you want to listen to your albums on, even if it's by streaming. Because a lot of my listening comes from, and this will be covered later in how some of these albums came to be listened to a second time. But a lot of my music outside, outside the house, come from my iPod Classic, which has been in my life for years. And when I'm driving to work, going on a walk, I've assembled a playlist of a couple of thousand songs that I really like, and just shuffle those. So not playing a specific artist, a specific album, just a mix of everything. And what's great about that, it covers all moods. So whatever's going on, you can skip tracks, and inevitably they're not all going to sync in the right way because there's different genres in there and all the rest of it. But my point I was coming to with Bad Reputation is listening to some of these songs in isolation, they're not so special. But listening to them one after the other on this album made them really special, and I increased my rating, although not seemingly by much. I always used to give this a generous 3.5 out of 5 or a 7 out of 10. And that's because there were some awesome tracks on it, which really pulled the rest of the album up. But the rating has gone up on this album to an 8 out of 10, which ironically is still the weakest of those 5 albums, but by a long stretch, not as much as I thought it was. So that experience on the weekend made me think there's got to have been other times in the past here where I've gone back to albums a second time round and thought, this is a lot better than the first time round. I think generally I'm quite an impatient person, and if it doesn't hit first time round, sometimes anything really, whether it's a TV show, a film, I went through a period of watching maybe 5 films a night and watching 5 minutes of each film and thinking, this is rubbish, it's not happening. Whereas I'll sit through an hour of a film now waiting for something to happen before I get tedious. So maybe attitudes change, but who knows. And kind of that definitely made me think of some great examples of why you should give albums a second chance, because like this one, you might have the opinion that it's not so good, and this actually isn't the best example, because there are albums that I thought were pretty poor on the first run and actually have had a massive turnaround, and those are the albums I'm going to show. But the first pile is, there actually are some albums that just hit first time round, and I've picked out a group of 5 of those. So Bryan Adams' Reckless hit me first time. Chris Rea, The Road to Hell. Excellent from first listen. Kiss, Destroyer. Queen's a Night at the Opera. And Blackout by Scorpions. Now, on probably all of those occasions, actually, these were the biggest albums by those artists, which brings you around to a line of thinking that maybe we'll just listen to anything, and these are considered the first listens to be great because they genuinely are great. But I'm going to stop you there because there are 3 examples of albums I listened to for the first time and thought this isn't that great, and then were blown away afterwards. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about A Question of Balance by the Moody Blues from 1970. So this was for me my second album of the Moody Blues listening. I'd listened to On the Threshold of a Dream first time round, and that was all down to, and I talked about this little in my review of A Question of Balance. I went to buy a job lot of records locally, fairly locally, and On the Threshold of a Dream was included in this job lot. I'd never really heard much of the Moody Blues before. Nights in White Satin, a couple of tracks, but nothing massive. And there's a guy that I used to work with that's actually retired now who was big into the Moody Blues, and he said that all the first 7 albums are really good. So I think I actually picked the record up of this at a record fair, maybe. Where did I get the record? No, that was it. I was on eBay browsing through and I found 4 Moody Blues records for £10, which were A Question of Balance, Seventh Sojourn possibly, Every Good Boy Deserves Favour, and then a later one, Sur la Mer, I believe. Could be wrong on that. But if I get my Discogs up I can find the whole thing. But the full truth doesn't really matter for the context of this video. So listen to On the Threshold of a Dream, and actually that could be included in here as well. The first time round, okay, it's decent, and then really improved second time round. So it was a winter's night. I remember very well, about October or November, I listened to this on vinyl for the first time, and I thought it was quite a slow album. The first track was Excellent Question, but then the rest of the album was quite sluggish, and I think if you were to look at it critically, it can be seen as quite sluggish. But then maybe a week later, I went out for a walk, sort of an hour's walk, and this album's about 3/4 of an hour. So I thought, I'd got it on the iPod, I thought let's give this a second try. And my God, was it different. Every track resonated and sounded 10 times better than the first time round. Now there's the argument here of that was on vinyl, the second time round was on headphones, out on a walk with nothing else to distract me. There's that argument. But this was an album that was massively elevated, in my opinion, after going for that walk, and stayed as earworms in my brain for a couple of months afterwards. We then go to an example which is maybe not part of this as such. Pink Floyd The Wall. This is, for those of you who don't know, my favourite album of all time, yet. Because I haven't listened to everything yet, but of what I've listened to, it's my favourite album by Pink Floyd, most certainly. Now, the first time listening to this album, I listened to it on shuffle. Not the best idea with a concept album like The Wall. And I got to the trial, which is the last track, about 5th track round, and I thought, what on earth is going on here? And then this album was a real evolution, because I listened to it, okay, in its normal, natural order, and thought this is a good album. And then I watched the film, the Pink Floyd The Wall film. And this is, as I say, a bit of a different example to those that I'm giving. But I watched Pink Floyd The Wall, the film, and my God, that really opened this album up, because it gave you a complete visual of what was going on. Because some of these tracks, it's difficult to get an idea of what's going on in your head sometimes with some of this. But the Wall, the film, opened it up massively. And from that day onwards, I have adored this album. And that's why you can't quite see behind me. I've got the immersion edition of this album, and probably wouldn't get the immersion edition of any of the others, purely for that live album. Is there anybody out there? The Wall, live. So that's another example. And then finally, in this first example of those that have just blown me away, is this, which you'll see. Because I haven't got the CD of this, so I thought I'd show off the big 40th anniversary reissue. Now, for those of you who watched last week's video, which I hope is last week's video, about my Bomber review, I don't need to talk anymore about the vinyl inside this. But anyway, the record itself. This was another one that I sort of listened to actually only halfway through. So Overkill, Stay Clean, I Won't Pay Your Price, I'll Be Your Sister, and Capricorn. Listen to those again on another walk. So this is the other way around this time. On a walk round the block, and I just remember this wall of sound. That's all I remember. And it was almost a bit too loud for me to contemplate at that time. This was only a couple of years ago, so I'm not talking 30 years ago. You know, my hair's still blonde, I'm only 22, so I can't make these stories up. But this was a couple of years ago. And although I really liked Overkill, as I say, it was just a wall of sound. It was just all too much for me at the time. So again, a couple of weeks later, I came, listened to the whole album. Wow. Absolutely mind blown, particularly by No Class, Damage Case, which after the smooth Capricorn, as Lemmy calls it, wow. Just thrashing tracks, excellent. And then Tear You Down and Limb from Limb. Is it Tear You Down? No, it's Limb from Limb, which has kind of got a bit of a slower start and then just go to full pelt the second half. That Limb from Limb was a driving playlist example, where I was in the car, had put it on my driving playlist and thought it was okay, and then was just driving along one day and heard that almost the second half, that really quick riffage and tempo change. And I remember just sat there in the car like, wow, this sounds awesome. And why you don't pick it up the first time round or even the second time round sometimes is amazing. And that's why I've got a rule with, well, anything that I've got on my iTunes, that is. If I go and listen to an album for the first time, I'll always put all of the tracks in my driving playlist, because there's an odd chance that it might come up and there's a track that you've not really thought is brilliant, that you sit in the car and think, oh, that's really good. You can equally sit there and think, oh my god, this isn't really good. Why have I put this on here for? And there's a couple of examples of contrasting emotions with that. But those are 4 albums that have been really special and really excellent to me. But only after listening to them 2 or 3 times. But then there are albums that aren't the best in the world. I'll fully admit that. Aren't 5-star albums like these. Although I said Bad Reputation is a 4-star album. And these 3 albums here are also inspiration for this video. More so the third one, so we'll talk about that first. And this is Scorpions' penultimate album, if they don't do any more, Return to Forever from 2015. And this was an album that I was going to do a review of because I thought that it was a little bit unfairly panned. It wasn't panned as such, but some people thought, you know, it's not very good. Others thought this is a return to the classic Scorpions. I'm somewhere in the middle. I listened to this for the first time, and I almost didn't want to like it because it almost seemed a bit too much commercial. Like Scorpions were trying a bit too hard to go back to their roots and back to the great rock days of Blackout and Love Drive and Animal Magnetism and Love at First Sting and even Savage Amusement. I could have put Savage Amusement in this because I don't think that hit me first time round, but I think if I could talk about everything I would, so I could be here a couple of hours. But this was an album that I played and I just loved some of the tracks from day one. And then this was an interesting one because I loved maybe 4 or 5 of the tracks and then parked it. Didn't listen to it for a while because I thought it was a good album, but I moved on to something else at the time. And again, it was the driving playlist that really helped. Heard a few of these tracks and thought, ooh, these are quite good with a listen. Shall we give it another listen? And that's exactly what I did. And then again, the album much better on second or even third listen. I think I've listened to this album 4 or 5 times now, and only earlier today at 6:30 in the morning was I chugging up the road to the great catchy song Catch Your Look and Play, which is a really great sort of party time song. So there's that again, the first time round I loved a couple of the tracks, but there's most of the tracks on this album that I really like now. But this album is limited because it's a good album for what it is, but it's not classic Scorpions, and for that I only gave it 3 stars. There's then another album that's quite a funny story. And just on the Scorpions link, The reason I'd got to Return to Forever is because, as you would have seen in a previous video, I'd bought the whole discography of Scorpions, apart from Return to Forever, and then had listened to most of the other stuff and got Return to Forever cheap and listened to that. But on that topic, there's another person I've been listening to most of the discography of, and that's Chris Rea. And I've just noticed I have got that at the bottom of this pile as well. And first up, I'm going to talk about his 1980 album, Tennis. Okay, so I bought this album, Deltix, or Deldix, however you want to pronounce it, Wired to the Moon and Water Sign, all in a job lot from Discogs. So I bought another job lot from eBay of the CDs, which included most of the later period, but some of these earlier ones I hadn't got, and I got them fairly cheap with other stuff. So sure enough, started listening to Tennis, and the first time I heard it, I thought it was really bad. I really did. So, particularly the first track I can point critique at, which is a track I actually really like now. And the first track, if you haven't heard it, is basically, do you like tennis? Do you like tennis? Do you like tennis? Do you like tennis? Yes, I do. And I was just sat there going, nowhere near the awesomeness of this, okay? Or Auberge, or Shamrock Diaries, or Dancing with Strangers. And again, played the whole album and just thought, this is really poor. This is really poor. I remember speaking to my dad about it, in particular the Tennis track. And then don't you hate just being wrong? Because I gave this a second try and it sounded much better. Tennis, the track, was just like an earworm, one of those you shouldn't really like, but really liked it. Since I Don't See You Anymore and Dancing Girls was really good. Good News as well. And then Stick It, which is almost like a Billy Joel-esque track. Again, not the best album in the world, maybe a 3-star album, but I'd have probably given this a 1.5 or a 2, my first listen. So the second listen elevated that massively. Again, this is a bit of a different story, because this is Deltix, which is Chris Rea's 1979 album. And it wasn't until yesterday evening that I listened to this for probably the 3rd time. So I, again, got this on CD, listened to it once or twice, and there were a couple of decent tracks actually on this. So Raincoat and a Rose, Diamonds, Don't Want Your Best Friend, and A Letter from Amsterdam. I thought, well, you know, decent tracks, not Chris Rea's best, but it's his early stuff, so he's still growing into the part. But knew in the back of my head that this wasn't the classic of Chris Rea, and again, I'd probably rather listen to this any day of the week. And last night I was having a bit of a tidy up of some of my records, and found this in record form that I hadn't played. I'd played the CD, but bought the record a while ago for £1, believe it or not, and hadn't played it. So I gave that a try. And then tracks like Twisted Wheel, The Things That Lovers Should Do, they became better, but this album was still limited. But I think my point is that I remember this as being very poor, with maybe 3 or 4 really good tracks, 3 or 4 good tracks. But even that second listen, still pulled it up slightly, even though it's not the best album in the world. So a lot of case studies here for albums that weren't so good on the first listen and really improved afterwards. And this was another slow burner. The final one before we talk about maybe the opposite effect. But there are a couple of tracks I want to talk about as well, which are all Scorpions, funnily enough. Crazy World, which is another later period Scorpions album, if you want to say that, which is 1990. And this is a bit of a slow burner, but particularly the second half of the album, once you've listened to it a couple of times, this matches the peak Scorpions for me, at least the late 70s, early 80s stuff. And then you get to a couple of albums which I listened to once, and again, the whole driving playlist idea. And these will be the final ones we look at, I think, because I'll have exhausted the point perhaps. Face the Heat, Scorpions, and there ain't much to shout about on this. But one track, Alien Nation, is excellent. And I only know that because I was listening to it the other day on my driving playlist. So, driving home from work, and this really heavy riffage starts. And when you've got your own playlist and you think, I don't know what this is, you think, this is a bit worrying, I've put something in wrong. And sure enough, I looked, not while I was driving, and it was Alien Nation from Face the Heat. And I remember reading before and reading a couple of reviews that Alien Nation was excellent, and the rest of the album was a bit crappy. So that reaffirmed that on Face the Heat. Scorpions' next album, which I'm not going to show the front cover because it's the usual nudity. Pure Instinct, in fact, I'll show it very quickly. There you go. If you pause the video correctly, you'll be alright. And there's a track on here called Soul Behind the Face, which is more of the ballad type, but Scorpions did ballads so well, didn't they? And another track that I was on the way home from work. I remember exactly where I was. And this may be only a couple of months ago. And this track came on. And I thought, ooh, I like this, but then didn't realise it at the time. I mean, bear in mind, this was track 5 of 11. An interesting thing here is, and I maybe dismissed things by that point, so my mind wandered to another place when listening to it the first time. Possibly. I bought this album out for the fun, because however many listens of Eye to Eye I have, I don't think I'm going to enjoy it anymore. But then finally, in a complete change in genre, I was quite positive about this the first time I heard it, and that was the debut of The Script, which is a British band. I think most people probably heard of them in some aspect. They've had a fair few hits. I think this was 2008. Yeah, 2008. And this was just purely one that I bought because if you're not in the UK, you can go to a charity shop, and some charity shops do multi-buys on CDs. And this very charity shop did 5 CDs for £1. So I probably picked up 3 that I really wanted. And then this was there and another one. And I know my sister was into The Script back in the day. Say back in the day, like 10 years ago. And she was into The Script. And I thought, well, I'll buy this. She might like it if I don't. But it's the sake of like 20 pence. If you'd have bought the 3 albums, it still would have been £1. So you're effectively getting those 2 for free. And I gave this a whirl. And I really liked it. Really liked it to the point of maybe a 3-star album. So liked it is probably the better word. And there were some tracks. So The Man Who Can't Be Moved, Break Even, Rusty Halo, I'm Yours, If You See K, Anybody There. I really enjoyed. Careful. I enjoyed all of those tracks for what they were. And then I put them in the driving playlist, and this had the opposite effect. Every time any of those tracks have come up, I've skipped them because I don't want to hear them. And this opens up a whole new can of worms, and I've already been going 20 odd minutes, so this could turn into an hour if I'm not careful. A whole new can of worms. If you're listening to this, followed by this, and not Eye to Eye, followed by, why can these things never be in the right bloody way around? Followed by this, maybe this coming last is something you don't want to particularly hear at that time and a place. So my point is, does this sound better just as an album itself within its own genre without the other stuff? It's an interesting point, isn't it? It's a very interesting point. But back to the point that we'll listen to any old rubbish. Because there's a definite point about that, because there are some songs that I just don't like. But naturally get into your head as earworms. So Lisa Stansfield, All Around the World, was a track that I wasn't really bothered about. My dad bought a greatest hits CD the other week. Sure enough, it's an earworm, and I actually don't mind that. Beautiful South, Song for Whoever. A song that, just to be placid, really. But again, got into that. Status Quo, Down Down. Just a bit of a placid track again. Really got into that. Status Quo, Paper Plane. If you hear things enough, do you just get into them? Maybe there are some things like rap that, as much as I can hear that, I'm never going to get into that. Sorry folks who are into rap, but I suspect you weren't around here so long. And then you've got the opposite effect of tracks that are just overplayed in your own collection. So I very much got to that point recently with, where's it gone? If I can find it. I got to that point with, sure enough it would be the bottom of the pile, wouldn't it? I got to that point with Return to Forever, where I'd listened to it so many times recently that I just got fed up with it. And I say recently, like a couple of months back. So revisiting that was nice. But there are certain tracks that you hear so much and think, oh God, I don't want to hear them again. So you've got the obvious Sweet Caroline, Neil Diamond. As many of you know, Neil Diamond's one of my favourite artists. That's just irritating. It's played so much in pop culture these days. I Want to Break Free, Queen. Never liked that track, never will. And then you've got, more so in America, but somewhat over here. Journey, Don't Stop Believing, Survivor, Eye of the Tiger. Oh, and those tracks are just overbearing. But the interesting thing here is I hadn't heard Eye of the Tiger for ages. I took it off my driving playlist. I don't really watch TV ads. I'm sure, is Eye of the Tiger on an advert for one of the betting sites? It might well be, because it's like the classic... No, it's not Eye of the Tiger. But it's obviously the Rocky idea. And I hadn't heard that for ages, and really loved that when I heard it again. So, interesting how these things go, that you don't hear things for a while, and then you love them again. So, just some interesting thoughts there, and I think I'm going to bring this to a close. As I say, it wasn't really scripted, this, but I've really enjoyed talking about a lot of music today, that, albeit all kind of in brief, that gives the idea that you ought to give albums a second try, because particularly in this age of disposable content, whether that be YouTube videos, music, film, everything, I think it's worth just sitting down and giving things a try, because there's so much available. Of course, you worry what you're missing out on. But when, back in the day, and this is a bad example because this is a 2015 album, if you only had this album, you have to revisit it. If you'd gone and spent big money on the album, you'd have to revisit it and probably grow to like it. And that's exactly what I've learned to do with a lot of albums. Granted, there's the odd album that I listen to once and think, I'm not bothered, and then move on. But I might come back to them in 2, 4, 6 months' time. And that's exactly what I'll do with a couple of the albums up here. In fact, I'll very quickly get those out. Albums that I'm talking about. So there's those two there. Any more I can think of? There's one here that I'm looking at the moment. Anything else? Is 3 going to be enough? I think 3 is probably enough. Unless I can see anything else very quickly. No, we'll go with these 3. 2 of them being Chris Rea albums, which just didn't hit the first time round, which is Water Sign and Wired to the Moon. Just couldn't get on with those the first time I heard them. And then very recently, because I'm going to see him in a couple of weeks, Kiefer Sutherland's Bloor Street, which I listened to recently, and I couldn't get along with that too much. So it will be interesting, and I'll feed back. I will feed back in future videos. If I listen to these 3 albums again, does the theory work? Maybe it doesn't. But that is a big ramble, and that's probably enough for today's video. So nothing that's scripted as such, and nothing that's particularly come to a particular outcome, apart from correlating a lot of albums that come to the point of, yeah, if you give them a second go, they might sound a bit better. So if you enjoyed that little ramble, leave a like down below. Please leave your thoughts down below. Do you just click with an album the first time? Do you give up after listening to an album the first time? Thoughts? Subscribe for regular music content, and until the next time, thank you for your company, and I'll see you again in the next video. Goodbye for now.